The most dangerous tax is not the one that arrives loudly. It is the one that begins as an exception, sells itself as fairness, and quietly teaches the state that whatever can be measured can eventually be taxed. That is the first thing I would want you to understand. Most people still think the tax story in America moves in a straight line. You work, you earn, the government takes a piece of the income. That is unpleasant, but at least it is familiar. The public knows the vocabulary: income, wages, capital gains, payroll tax, property tax. Fine. People hate it, complain about it, adapt to it, and then go back to work. But the deeper danger in your source document is not really about one proposed wealth tax or one ballot measure or one California-style political experiment. Those are the surface. The real issue is mechanism. Once a government proves to itself that it can politically inventory what people own, assign a value to it, and normalize the idea that ownership itself is an ongoing tax base, the conversation changes forever. That is the real story. Not one state, not one election, not one slogan about taxing billionaires. The real story is that the line between taxing what you earn and taxing what you already built becomes much easier to cross. Once the machinery for measuring, tracking, and reassessing private wealth is socially accepted, that is where I think people are still asleep. They keep arguing about who gets targeted first, the rich, the ultra-rich, the billionaire class. Fine. That is how every tax expansion sells itself in the beginning. It enters wearing moral theater. It says, do not worry. This is not about you. That is the oldest line in the book. The source document is powerful, where it traces that pattern back to the federal income tax. It reminds people that the original modern income tax entered American life as something tiny, narrow, and supposedly contained a low rate, a high threshold, a small affected class. That is always how the new pipe gets installed. Narrow enough to avoid resistance, moral enough to sound fair, temporary enough to sound harmless. Then time passes, crises arrive, politics expands, thresholds move downward, and the exceptional tax becomes part of ordinary life. Fe file site fe turn 49 file 0 fe, that pattern matters far more than any one headline, because once you understand the pattern, you stop asking the childish question, would they really come after ordinary people? The better question is, if the mechanism gets built, what usually happens to thresholds over time when governments keep needing more money? That is a much darker question. It is also much more useful. I have always believed the state behaves a lot like any other institution. Under stress, it begins by protecting itself, then its promises, then its narrative. It rarely begins with restraint, especially not after it has already promised far more than it has cleanly funded. This is why California matters in the source material, even if you strip away every bit of internet drama. California is not important because it is uniquely evil. It is important because it is a large, wealthy, politically influential jurisdiction willing to test what kinds of tax ideas can still be sold inside a population that has grown accustomed to permanent fiscal improvisation. That is the role of California in the story. It is the canary only in the sense that it reveals where the air is already getting thin. And what makes the air thin is not one proposal. It is accumulated promises, pensions, healthcare obligations, long duration liabilities, infrastructure fantasies, program spending that is emotionally easy to approve and politically brutal to reverse. Once enough of those promises stack up, elected officials run into the same hard wall every indebted system runs into. The money was promised before it was funded. Now someone has to be made legible enough to pay. That is where asset taxation becomes seductive. Income can move, capital gains can be delayed, businesses can relocate, high earners can change domicile. But a house sits there, a deed sits there, land sits there, recorded, mapped, assessed, visible. That visibility is what makes home equity such a tempting future target in any world where governments become more comfortable taxing assets rather than flows. This is why I do not think the real issue is whether one ballot measure says 5% on billionaires today. The real issue is that once the state gets the public used to the logic of asset-based taxation, the home becomes emotionally and administratively easier to reach than almost anything else. People always say the same thing at this point. They would never do that. I have heard some version of that sentence around almost every major expansion of state reach in my lifetime. They would never track that. They would never freeze that. They would never monitor that. They would never lower that threshold. They would never make it permanent. Then the program arrives, gets normalized, and a few years later, the same people say it was inevitable. What changed mechanism? That is what changed. Once a mechanism exists, imagination expands. That is the great danger of this entire wealth tax conversation. Not merely the tax rate, the inventory principle. The moment government is socially authorized to say, Tell us everything you own, tell us what it is worth, and let us reassess the obligation each year. Property rights stop feeling like settled ownership and start feeling like conditional occupancy under a stronger auditor. That is a very different country, and it is closer to the deeper fear in your source than the loud language about billionaires. The source as strongest insight is not, they want to tax the rich. It is to tax wealth at all. The state must first make all wealth measurable, categorized, and reviewable. That is the real transition. Once the cataloging becomes normal, taxation becomes only one possible use of the catalog. Fe felicite, fe turn 49, file 0 fe. That is why I take the surveillance angle seriously, even though most people will hear it as paranoia. The problem is not whether one specific agency is currently watching one specific family for one specific purpose. The problem is infrastructure when technology makes property more legible. Governments and quasi-government systems do not forget that capacity. Aerial assessment, AI-based partial review, automated valuation models, linked financial databases, real-time credit histories, digital property records, smart devices, platform-level monitoring. Every one of these things makes taxation, enforcement, and reassessment easier. Ease changes politics. A thing that was once too hard to administer becomes newly tempting once software removes the friction. That is why I no longer ask only, would they want to do this? I also ask, how easy is the system making it? When administration gets easier, resistance thresholds fall. That is the lesson most people miss. They think liberty survives because it is morally preferable. Often it survives only so long as control is administratively expensive. Once control becomes cheap, the moral arguments alone become much weaker defenses. This is why I think the home equity part of the story matters so much, not because your house will necessarily be taxed tomorrow in some new exotic way, but because the home is the most visible, most politically defensible, and most emotionally underestimated store of middle-class wealth in America. People still think of homeownership as a private achievement. Governments increasingly see it as an accessible platform. That difference in perception is crucial. If you are the homeowner, your house is the place you built, protected, and maintained. If you are the state under fiscal stress, the house is a recorded reservoir of taxable value. And once enough voters become convinced that untaxed or lightly taxed stored wealth is morally available to fund. Today, S promises the emotional barrier begins to weaken. This is where the tax the rich story becomes so effective and so dangerous. It is not dangerous because billionaires are fragile creatures who must be defended at all costs. It is dangerous because it trains the public to accept a new principle without forcing them to think through the life cycle of that principle. The principle is simple. If accumulated asset value can be continuously measured, then accumulated asset value can be continuously taxed. Once that principle is normalized at the top end, the historical pattern is ugly. Thresholds drift downward, rates get adjusted, exceptions multiply. The category broadens, administrators reinterpret emergencies, justify acceleration. And soon enough, the people who said, this is not about you, begin discussing how much you really have. This is why I have no patience for the nay-favy version of the debate. The nay-favy version says, I am not a billionaire, so why should I care? That is the wrong level of analysis. You should care, because the question is not whether you are in the first taxable class. The question is whether the logic and infrastructure built for the first class can eventually be repurposed toward the next one. That is where history usually takes you, not by moral leap. By administrative, I think the source was also right to highlight how fragile private ownership already is in the digital era. Even outside government companies remotely disable features. Platforms mediate access. Financial scoring systems influence opportunity. Software updates change what you are allowed to do with devices you believed you owned outright. This matters because cultural conditioning always arrives before political expansion. Once people get used to the idea that ownership is conditional, revocable, or constantly monitored inside one domain, they become less resistant when similar logic appears in another. That is how systems train populations, not all at once by acclamation. This is why I would frame the threat more clearly than the source does. The deepest risk is not one wealth tax. It is the erosion of the old assumption that private property sits outside continuous state and platform review. Once that assumption fades, taxation is just one of several consequences. And because home equity is the most emotionally passive form of wealth many families possess, it is exactly the place where they are least mentally prepared to defend themselves. Stocks feel abstract, business ownership feels strategic, trust structures feel sophisticated, but the house feels normal. That is what makes it vulnerable. Nobody watches the normal thing closely enough until it becomes contested. So what should a rational person do with this? Not panic and not dismiss. I have no respect for either extreme. Panic usually leads to bad decisions made in the wrong order. Dismissal leads to years of passive exposure while the rules shift underneath you. The better response is structural defense. That means first understanding how much of your net worth is visible, fixed, and politically easy to target, then thinking about legal separation, trusts, entity structures, liability layering, jurisdictional diversification where appropriate, liquidity planning, debt restructuring where it actually reduces exposure rather than merely adding risk. And above all, not waiting until the politics become fully obvious. The source talks about stripping equity, building lines of credit using trusts and LLCs, building a war chest of hard assets and reducing name on record exposure where lawful and prudent. Some of that will be too aggressive or too situational for many people. Fine, the exact tactic depends on scale, location, and law. But the deeper instinct is correct. Once the system starts signaling interest in asset-based taxation or asset-based reassessment mechanisms, passive ownership becomes a weaker position than many people realize. File a site, Fay turn 49 file 0 Fay. That does not mean everyone needs a bunker mindset. It means everyone should start thinking like an owner inside a system that is becoming more interested in inventory. That is a very different posture. And if you are not ready for legal structures yet, at least be ready in mind. A property is not just a house. It is also a line item inside a local and state fiscal imagination. Home equity is not just your net worth. It is also visible collateral in the eyes of any state desperate enough to ask whether stored wealth can be made to support wider promises. This is why I think the most important move right now is not tactical. It is conceptual. Stop thinking about taxation only as an annual haircut on income. Start thinking about it as a regime question. What kinds of things does the system believe it has moral permission to assess, monitor, and extract from? That is the real battlefield. And in that battlefield, the house matters enormously. The source is emotionally right that most people are too relaxed, not because the apocalypse is scheduled for next Tuesday, but because people always underestimate the significance of the first socially accepted mechanism. Once the mechanism is in place, later expansion does not need to win the same philosophical argument from scratch. It inherits legitimacy from the earlier step. That is why California matters. Not because it guarantees national imitation, because it rehearses national imagination. It tests what language works, what thresholds poll, well, what populations can be isolated politically, what resistance forms, what institutional tools are already available, and whether the public still reacts to asset taxation as if it were a line that should not be crossed. That is how policy frontiers move, not through inevitable nationwide replication, through repeated local proof that the argument can survive contact with voters. This is also why I think the phrase taxing home equity is so powerful emotionally. People intuit something true even if they do not phrase it cleanly. The intuition is this: once government can reach into what you already built and continue charging you against that stored value, ownership starts feeling less like ownership and more like managed tenancy. That is the fear, and it is not irrational. Now, to be intellectually honest, we should say this too. Not every property tax system is a wealth tax. Not every reassessment is confiscation. Not every proposal becomes law. And not every state follows California into every bad idea. Fine, true, but none of those truths erase the structural lesson. The lesson is that debt-heavy governments eventually go searching for visible reservoirs of value, and homes are visible. The lesson is that technologies of monitoring reduce the cost of finding, valuing, and reassessing those reservoirs, and lower administrative costs changes political temptation. The lesson is that tax history in America does not support naïve optimism that thresholds stay where they begin. And once you accept those three things, you stop laughing off the issue as just something for billionaires. That is the entire point. This is not a call to despair. It is a call to realism. The state does not need to seize your house outright to change your relationship with ownership. It only needs to become more confident in its right to continually audit the value inside it and more politically comfortable using that value as part of the revenue story. That is how the atmosphere changes. Not with one loud confiscation, with 100 smaller normalizations. That is why I think the best investors and homeowners in the coming decade will not only study returns, they will study structure, not only wealth building, wealth defensibility, not only appreciation visibility, not only tax efficiency, tax regime direction. That is the adult way to read this moment, because the most valuable asset is not the one that goes up the fastest. It is the one you can still truly control when the rules around control begin getting softer and more conditional. That is where I would want my mind. Not on slogans, not on partisan comfort, on mechanism, because mechanism is what survives the campaign speech. And if the mechanism expands, the people who waited for a perfect warning will discover what every era eventually teaches the slow reader. The warning was never going to arrive as a confession. It was going to arrive as a pilot program, a narrow threshold, a morally flattering slogan, and a public too distracted to notice that the system had just been taught a new way to see private wealth. That is why I take this seriously, not because the end has arrived, because the line between earning income and owning taxable visibility is getting easier for governments to cross. And once that line gets crossed enough times, the future of homeownership feels very different than the past people still assume they are living in. That is the real danger. Not that everything changes at once, that the mechanisms change first, and the public only understands the consequence after those mechanisms have already been normalized.